When I gathered with our founding members to reflect on the stories of this congregation, we heard a lot of stories about your ministers. You'll hear some of them today. Frankly, I learned some things I did not know about my predecessors and not sure I can unlearn. But most of all, we heard stories about each other, about this community and what it is to choose it and choose each other over and over and over again. And so this service in honor of our 60th anniversary is not just about me or Reverend Amanda proclaiming things to you. It is about the words of honest reflection you can speak to each other. And so I would invite you to gather in what I'm calling a community conversation. Inside your order of service is a little card. They're all different colors. Some of them are neon, so you can't lose them. And on those cards are printed 2 questions inviting you to reflect on the legacy of those who have gone before us in this place, and to reflect then also on the legacy you hope we leave behind for those who will follow us when we are long gone. And so I invite you in this time of community reflection to talk to each other. Yes, talk to each other in groups of 2 or 3 or 4. We will take a few minutes to invite that reflection, make space for each other. And if you are new and know nothing of the legacy of this place, consider simply saying what you yearn for in a community such as this one. And listen to hear if you hear some of those yearnings reflected in the sharing of your fellow worshipers. Turn to face each other. The floor is yours. If you are able, I invite you to face forward again. Turn those chairs around and know that this conversation is only the very beginning. Now, last Sunday, when Reverend Karen wanted everybody to start listening, she did like an egg timer. And I might get an egg timer. I think that would be helpful. The fact that this conversation is so rich means that we have only just begun it. I encourage you to reach out to those people you had 3 minutes to talk to today and take 30 minutes over a gourmet cup of coffee after the service. And you're invited, as you are willing, to place those cards on special little sticky tape circles we've put up across the bridge so we can remind each other of this legacy we share. So we move now into a time I could not be more delighted about. Before us, our founding members of River Road UU congregation, we gathered together on Monday for a little lunch and learn, didn't we, folks? For a time to share and swap stories and tell the tales of these 6 decades as River Road Unitarian Universalist congregation. Now, who you have here before you are not our only founding members. We also have Carol, who's not coming up because she's just being a little shy, and that is fine. Introverts have always been welcome here at River Road, haven't they? We've divided our sharing this morning into 4 separate segments. Stories about the earliest days, stories about learning together, stories about the social justice work that enables us to serve together, and ultimately, the last phase of our conversation together are stories about the ways that we take care of each other. Stories about the way we nurture our spirits and nurture our souls sometimes when we need it the very most. So this morning for this panel conversation, as the founders and I chat, we invite you to do exactly what I did on Monday afternoon over brunch, eavesdrop. I think you'll learn some new things. And in the midst of each movement of our sharing, we'll invite you to sing a verse of the song you just heard, an original composition by Cliff Harden with lyrics by Jan Elliker. At the end, we'll rise together and sing the chorus with full-throated gusto as a blessing for all that we have shared. And so, welcome and thank you. We have before us Jean Haddon, Yeah, clap for each of them. Ann Starbird and her husband, Lynn, who is in the back. Nancy Cedar, who was on the search committee that made me come be your minister. I think you might have been the first River Roader I ever spoke to, Nancy Cedar. Yeah. Joan Brightman. And when did you join, Joan?
63.
1963. And the one and only Brad Patterson. So we'll start with reflections on the early days, and folks know that your microphones are on. All you have to do is hold them up close to you, and our folks will hear you. Nancy, you lived across the street.
Right. I moved in to an old farmhouse on River Road in 1962, and my neighbor behind me came up with a plate of cookies and asked me what church I'd be interested in. And I said, well, we went to the Unitarian church in Connecticut, so that's really what I'd prefer. And she said, oh, are you in luck? They had just bought a piece of land on the corner of Whittier Boulevard and River Road. And there's going to be a Unitarian church there. I didn't believe her. It was so fortuitous. And I looked over at the lot, and it was this very heavily wooded lot, very, up and down, and a spring behind, and I kind of doubted where the church was going to fit.
You were like, good luck building on that.
Right. And that's exactly what Ed Bennett did. Ed Bennett was a developer of Carderock Springs who found this lot, and he was one of our early members, or founding members, and he convinced the developer that this would not be a good lot to put any houses on, and got it for a pretty good price. And you can see in the prize-winning community at Carderock Springs how his philosophy of blending the building into the natural surroundings worked here just beautifully.
I love how Ed Bennett ensured that we could be on this property by being a little sneaky and convincing other people they couldn't. And before we were here, we met at the Radnor School. And Brad, you remember being over there at the Radnor School. It was right next to your house, wasn't it? Yeah?
Correct, yes.
Oh, get that microphone up there. Do you want to tell us about what it was like for you and your family to walk over to Radnor School?
If you don't mind, I've got a couple of paragraphs that I've made ahead of time. This is a very special morning. We're gathered here for a celebration. What are we celebrating? We are showing our pride for 40 years of love and accomplishment here at our River Road Unitarian Universalist congregation. When did we start? In 1959. Our early days began with a small group of men and women led by Muriel Davies, the widow of one of the most distinguished senior UU members. And this group made a deal with a local elementary school, the Radnor School. Could our group use the school on Sundays to conduct UU religious services using some of the school's own storage space of our home, or to stuff our charts to use them? Yes, and 2 years later, we hired a senior minister, Robert Lewis. I had built a fine home in the woods just across from the school, and we hired a senior minister, and with wife and 3 children, we joined the church and walked across this sunny meadow on Sundays. My wife's membership was 212. My membership was 213. And we brought with us, on that day, 1959, we brought 3 children with us. And my daughter is here. Would she raise your hand, Dawn? Radnor School, 1959. In 1964, our group was able to purchase this land here. And we still have a photograph of our expanded group of men, women, and enthusiastic children, all gathered in a woody circle, patting the big yellow tractors awaiting their duty. We rapidly constructed the principal segment of this church building so expertly that we moved into it by September of 1965, accompanied by a National American Institute of Architects award as we moved into this building. Now, a major construction was that fire plug that you see every day. Its piping stretched all the way to the center of Whittier Road. Another construction innovation is our beautiful memorial garden with its gentle benches and especially its concrete tables displaying the sad but lovely individual plaques of those who have passed away. Our membership book, right out here, now carries 2,521 people, names. Some have moved away, still others who have died, while still other names will be added who have just recently taken the membership oath. Let me conclude these remarks with special thanks to the church staff, whom we so admire, to the music department, who add such loveliness to our deliberations, to our assistant minister, for her impressive wit and energy, and to our senior minister, whose beauty and brilliance outshine her colleagues throughout the nation.
Brad, I'm going to call up some colleagues and say, Brad Patterson says I am outshining you. Member number 213, beloved of member number 212, your wife Shirley, you were married for over 65 years, and she is memorialized in that garden you lifted up. And you remember, Joan, you didn't teach RE, but you remember what it was like to be at Radnor School and what we had to do to actually have church every Sunday there. Could you say a couple words about that?
Well, I was listening to Brad talk about that Radnor allowed us storage space, but I'm afraid the religious educators they were observed carrying a lot of things in and a lot of things out every Sunday. So it wasn't quite as convenient as being in our own place.
Sometimes I still observe the religious educators carrying a lot of things in and out. And Ann, you and Lynn came here in 1968. And what I think I remember is that Lynn got connected with Dwight Kramer, who is one of our most beloved stalwart founding members. What were those days like?
We had just come back from 10 years in the Far East, and Lynn was assigned to the tie desk at the State Department, where he met somebody he had never met before named Dwight Kramer. And that was all well and good, and we came the following Sunday to River Road, not knowing that Dwight and Carol would be here, and Dwight certainly didn't know that we would be here. He expressed great surprise and pleasure as we came through the door, and did for us what he did for so many other people. He instantly made us feel welcome. He introduced us to other people. He told us about the various programs. He and Carol were our first contacts with River Road and have remained friends ever since.
And Dwight loved to talk about how he first met his love of his life, Carol Kramer, at coffee hour at All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. In fact, a great many of our founding members met either at coffee hour at All Souls Church or at the singles mixers in the gymnasium at All Souls Church, which were apparently very happening affairs in the 1960s. Indeed, the first Sunday morning gatherings of this congregation were people gathered around a small speaker in the middle of the table with the minister of All Souls Church at that time, A. Powell Davies, delivering his Sunday morning addresses, which, by the way, were printed in the Washington Post very often. Amanda, they've never printed mine. Have they printed yours? No. So the River Roaders would gather to listen on this tinny speaker to A. Powell Davies' sermons, and in the meantime, the real impetus for the founding of this congregation was the overflowing Sunday school program at All Souls Church. Is that what you remember?
No,
at Cedar Lane.
At Cedar Lane, because Cedar Lane was so full of children, they couldn't accommodate them. So they had several members form a core group looking for land, and that's, as Brad said, going to Radnor's school. And A. Powell Davies' widow, Muriel Davies, was the founding person for our church. And she was quite an organized lady. She knew how to tap lay leaders. She would spy people that looked like they were going to be strong leaders, like Kurt and Thelma Adams and other people like that, and she would get them involved. And we really survived largely on these wonderful leaders that she helped develop, even though they weren't NRE.
And that actually is where we're going to go next, is some deeper reflection on religious education. And you'll hear more about Muriel Davies, but for now, I want to invite you to remain seated and join us in one verse of the song you just heard, Pass On the Light. So Muriel Davies was, in fact, the first religious professional here at River Road. Before we had a minister, we had a religious educator. And there are ways in which, in the very earliest days, we were a religious education program looking for a congregation to join up with it. And what I recall you saying is, of course, Muriel was very, very organized. She was a great recruiter. She was a leader who could draw people toward you with not too much guilt, but the necessary amount to get you to say yes. And Joan, you had some recollections about what life was like for Muriel and Powell, as she would have called him, Powell, when they first moved here to the States, right?
Yeah. They came from Britain. They came from Britain, and his first, A. Powell Davies' first. They came from Britain, and A. Powell Davies' first congregation was up in Maine. And when they first came, I guess, to the church community, they were greeted by a band playing America, My Country 'Tis of Thee. And Muriel's thought was, oh, isn't that sweet? They're playing God Save the Queen. And then she told the story about the first very bad snow day up in this little Maine town. And A. Powell went in and opened up his church and got ready for the service. And it was the only church in town that opened that morning. So people who had come into town to go to their churches, finding them closed, went to the Unitarian church. And Muriel said very wryly, well, that was the last time that those churches didn't open on a snow day.
Scandalizing churchgoers from the beginning. In those early days, in fact, religious education at Cedar Lane was overflowing, and almost immediately religious education here was bustling, including the youth group. And you remember it being a little wild. The youth were pretty busy in those years, in the late 60s and early 70s.
Well, yes. We came here when Bill Haddon, from Albany, New York, and Bill Haddon came to town to set up the National Highway Safety Bureau. And we were living in an 1805 farmhouse outside of Albany. And I spent my days wrestling vegetables out of the garden and wrestling them into the children, which were... So we finally dragged ourselves here, 3 little boys and 1 large dog, and settled in Edmund Bennett's community across the street. Well, my experience in churches, well, we migrated in Albany from a very small Quaker meeting to a very small Unitarian church. And my experience was the minute you stepped into a church with children, they wanted you to teach Sunday school. And I was overwhelmed with moving to the big city from the mountain retreat, and so I really didn't teach. I just brought my children and turned them over to the good people who were teaching Sunday school. And one of them took to it quite well, and he has lifelong friends from Sunday school. And one of them came and went to class, and people to this day say, oh yes, I remember him. And the little one said it was just too noisy. But he came anyway.
So one of the signature curricula that we had in those days, and there have been a number of signature curriculum in religious education, was a program called The Church Around the Corner. I wonder how many of you remember that or took that curriculum as children and youth. And I think I remember an anecdote about going to see the Presbyterians, about what your sons thought about going to visit the Presbyterians.
Well, the older one was part of that excursion to the Presbyterian church, and he came back and said, I am never going there again. He said, they have so many candles.
Now, Carol Kramer and a lot of other people were involved in that Church Around the Corner program, too. And I think Carol or Dwight, one of you must have chaperoned the trip to the local Baptist church, because the story goes that somehow they got on the Baptist newsletter list, and that every week you, Carol, and Dwight received the Sword of the Lord newsletter from the Baptists. And eventually you had to call and request not to get the Sword of the Lord anymore. And I know you taught religious education. So when you and Lynn first came, were you teaching religious education from the start, Ann?
No.
No.
And I taught for exactly 1 semester because Muriel Davies pushed me into it. But my most vivid memory is 1 class, which there was a curriculum guide for, and it involved Lynn and me making bricks out of plaster of Paris in our kitchen. And while they were wet, we buried artificial artifacts in it, things like charred wood or kernels of corn. And the idea was that these represented advances in civilization. And we took these bricks, then dried, to the Sunday school on Sunday morning, and my group of fourth graders proceeded to go at them with small hammers and chisels. And when they found these artifacts, we had a discussion about what they represented. I do not know what any of those fourth graders may remember about this, but what I remember is at the end of the class, plaster of Paris covered the classroom, covered the children, and covered the teacher.
We're all learning lessons, aren't we? Another signature curriculum that actually we won't get too far into, because once we start, it'll be hard to stop, is the early sexuality curriculum about your sexuality, AYS, which was taught here in the 70s. The one thing I will say about AYS is, of course, that it was groundbreaking, that it transformed the way we talk forthrightly about our bodies, about consent, about power and dynamics in sexual relationships, and also the 70s slide deck that was showed in AYS is something that no one who went through it will ever forget. I also understand from listening to you all that the indomitable Muriel Davies had no small amount of conflict with our first minister, Robert Lewis. We won't get into that too much either. But underneath all of it, both Muriel and Reverend Lewis, whose wife, Sylvia, also became a minister, they helped the lay leaders sustain this bustling religious education program, and in time they passed it on to Maud Benjamin. Peter Benjamin, are you in here? So Maud Benjamin was our second religious educator, and like Muriel, she was an indomitable recruiter. How many of you were recruited to teach religious education by Maud Benjamin? Still in leadership today. That's right. And so the power to persuade, the power to pack this building with people ready to serve, and in many ways to turn this willingness to serve in religious education to also a willingness to build relationships and build justice in the world, that's where we'll go next. Because these pieces of our legacy aren't just in silos. When we're doing religious education, very often we're also doing social justice. When we're doing community building, very often we're also doing pastoral care. So as we get ready to move towards some stories about our social justice program, remain seated. Verse 2, pass on the light. With our founding as a religious education program looking for a congregation, much of our earliest social justice work was also connected to our teaching life as a community. So the daycare that my son just finished and graduated from to go to kindergarten was originally founded here at River Road as one of the only reasonably affordable childcare programs in all of Montgomery County. And right here where we built on this plot of land that Ed Bennett tricked other people into not building on also happens to be nestled in between what were, after the Civil War, two thriving African American communities, mostly of free black leaders leaders right here in our community trying to hang on to the property they had had for generations as development started to crowd in. One of those communities is called Scotland, which some of you will know, and is still a thriving townhouse community that we have been involved, even in my time, in helping to get a community center there in the Scotland community built. But one of our first programs was what we called Operation Ketchup, which was tutoring and after-school care for children and youth, largely from the Scotland community, but mostly around our entire region. And I wonder, Joan, you remember a little bit about that early organizing in Scotland and how we went to ask people what it was that they wanted most of all. Instead of us coming in and saying, here's what we're going to do, we asked people what they actually wanted. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, and one of the things they wanted was front porches. And so if you drive up Seven Locks Road, you will see that the community that remains all have front porches on their townhouses.
So as that whole community was under threat of total redevelopment, the land being swept out from under them, we as allies and friends asked what they wanted, and they said, we want front porches. Right? And what a powerful thing to do relational organizing, letting the people lead and tell us how to back them up in the midst of their own struggle. I think we're always invited into these partnerships for change, including this fall when we worked with the renewed Poor People's Campaign for the Democracy Teach-In. How amazing was that? And the fact that we had the Poor People's Campaign right here in our building is fitting because, in fact, we had been involved in the Poor People's Campaign originally from the very start, right, Nancy?
Well, we were helping. George Toney actually was the man that sort of got me involved too, saying the Poor People's Campaign, which you recall some of you, was down on the mall in the early 60s, and we provided bunks and food and transportation for them. And it was the beginning of our going down to the mall for many demonstrations. And our social justice committee had its own banner, which seems to have been misplaced somewhere, that we would carry down there along with a lot of good old folks that like to demonstrate for good causes, including anti-poverty, anti-race, racism, all kinds of good causes. I remember walking down there with Lynn Strauss, who is now the minister at Rockville, and I think she's maybe retiring soon, and we were walking alongside Dick Gregory, which is pretty nice. He deigned to speak to us.
I bet he did. There are so many community service partnerships that started right here in this space. So Bill Murray is in many ways, I only am half joking when I call him my sainted predecessor. He is in many ways our best beloved former senior minister in this space and one of my mentors. And through Bill's work, the Montgomery Housing Partnership, which is today the biggest developer of affordable housing in the county, started right here. Its first meeting was in this sanctuary. And his leadership of that organization was significant over the span of a lot of time. And Joan, you were involved with the Peace Action Task Force relatively early on, and Mary Rose Curtis's leadership on that?
Yeah, Mary Rose was the leader of Mary Rose was the leader of the Peace Action Task Force, and she took us in more directions than we thought we could go in. But we also, by the way, the peace pole by the stairs going up to the second level was put in when we were functioning, and we had a special ceremony to put that peace pole in. But we were also cooperating with a peace group that was a Maryland peace group. And one of my fondest memories of my years with the Peace Action Task Force was going down to Capitol Hill and munching through all the legislative buildings as well as the Capitol itself. And that was pre-9/11. So all you needed was your badge that you got because you were going to the different legislators' offices, and you could wander at will. And it was wonderful just looking at the frescoes and all the other artwork and the sayings down this narrow hall in one of the congressional buildings, all the lovely sayings up on the wall. And it was just a very nice experience. I will tell you one story of meeting with a legislator's aide. We all went into the office to say that we were here, and all the ladies were dressed in their suits as, by the way, suits with skirts, and with our suit blouses and our stockings and our heels. And the men all had their suits with jacket and tie. And we were told to go to this meeting room around the corner, and the aide would be there very quickly. And so we all went in, and we sat down at the sides of the table, sat up very straight, and in walks the aide, very casually dressed, takes the brim of the hat he was wearing, pushes it around to the back of his head, thumps himself down at the seat at the head of the table, and throws his leg up over the arm of the chair. And I was just thinking, oh my goodness.
Gender dynamics are still somewhat complicated. I don't know if you've heard. Sometimes men still walk into rooms and feel entitled. I think they do.
But all the men in the group had their suits and their ties on.
I bet
their
they
jackets.
did. The River Road men showed up ready to serve. Yes. And I know we can't talk about social justice unless we talk about two key committees and task forces that have been at the heart of our work for so many decades, the Latin American Task Network and our Racial Justice Task Force.
Right. And a lot of people here, I'm sure, are their lives have been changed by attending one of Don Cherry's wonderful trips to El Salvador. 17 of them, right? How many people here have been involved with that? I know teens that came back and said that their lives will never be the same. They got such a really different view.
At the heart of this place has always been a call to community, perhaps best expressed in Sunday worship. When we gathered for lunch, the founders remembered the creative and sometimes, frankly, wacky worship styles of Jim Curtis, who would turn this whole place into a range of encounter groups in the early 1970s. And of course, the preaching and pastoring of clergy and lay leaders over the years who helped to show us that even in the very hard times, we weren't alone. And I know Bill Murray made an impact on your life significantly, didn't he, Gene?
Well, he did, because actually we were both very interested in his philosophy and his sermons, and that was very meaningful. But in addition to that, he had a very personal quality about him. And one example of that from our personal experience is when our eldest son got married. I was alone at that time, and my son was going to marry a lovely Japanese girl, and her Presbyterian minister and 40 Japanese people were coming from Japan for the ceremony, and Bill Murray pulled the whole thing together. And it all took place in the Presbyterian church there on Wilson Lane in Bethesda. And the Japanese minister, Presbyterian, and Bill Murray, Unitarian, ran the whole show with hymns that could be sung in any language. And it was absolutely a wonderful feeling of unity. That's one example.
I know when we gathered together, we also talked a lot about the good parties. We talked about the community meals. We talked about the fellowship dinner skits where Sally Toney wrote really irreverent lyrics to classic Protestant hymns and Broadway show tunes alike. And we talked about Irv Kaplan apparently showing up in a toga, which we'll just have to imagine. All of that is part of how we connect to each other. And I'm going to fast forward us just a little bit by saying that the ways we connect to each other are also served by the literal pastoral care program. So Sylvia Friedman, some of you will remember, had such a vibrant pastoral care program. There were actually 2 different meeting times because we couldn't fit them all in one meeting room. And that this way that we take care of each other is not just because it's a way to be kind to each other, but because we yearn and need that connection. And so often here at River Road, necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. And that was also true when it came to our finances and the founding of one of our strongest community programs to this day. Right, Nancy?
Right.
The Bazaar.
I'm sorry.
The Bazaar.
Oh, that's right. This was something that was going to be earlier, so I'm just mixed up a little bit. But what I do recall when we had these rather hard times back in the 60s, early 70s, Dan Lewis, who was one of our wonderful early leaders, came up with a great idea for, we've got to get a fundraiser or we're not going to survive. So he created and we created the bazaar, the annual bazaar, and the first few bazaars had a live auction, which everybody loved to go to. We had not exactly drunken orgies, but they did serve wine.
That wasn't in the script.
Well, they were fun.
Didn't your husband was the live auctioneer at this not drunken orgy, right? Yeah.
Yeah. When we lived in Albany, we went to a whole lot of auctions because it was a depressed area at the time. And there were all these old houses emptying out. And my husband Bill Haddon collected a huge collection of antique carpenter tools, which of course we brought with us. And the Smithsonian now has those tools. We also collected our household furniture, which pretty ratty collection of which I still have jammed into the apartment. And anyway, he loved auctions, and so the opportunity came to. They were looking for an auctioneer, and he was really good. And he was really interested in hearing that sold. And I'll tell you one small story. One time, he said, sold. And it wasn't until we were getting in the car to go home that he realized that I was the one who had bought the drum set.
We have no shortage of surprises over the years, and in fact, no shortage of controversies. When it comes to building community, you can't all agree about everything, and I recall, for instance, you talked about the way that when we first introduced those candles for Joys and Concerns, Grace Hayes almost up and left because she thought maybe we were all becoming papists. All the ways that we build community, that we find a way for each other, and indeed that we worship as one, even with different beliefs and different perspectives and different tastes in music. Somehow it comes together to create one whole. And Anne, you wanted to talk a little bit about what the music program specifically has meant to you and to your family before we wrap it up.
Music has been extremely important to me here at River Road. And when I was thinking about the whole subject of what had been important to me, I came across a quote. As you know, Unitarian Universalists draw wisdom and meaning from a variety of sources, ancient and modern. A recent quote from Michelle Obama sums up my feelings about music and my experience of music at River Road. And I will quote, "Music helps us share ourselves, our dignities and sorrows, our hopes and joys. It allows us to hear one another, to invite each other in. Music shows us that all of it matters. Every story within every voice, every note within every song. That is what music at River Road has meant to me, and I will always be grateful.
I can add one program here at River Road I remember very well was a program called Reflections on a Lifetime. Maybe some of you participated in that. And some of the elderly people in the congregation, we'd go to them and say, some of them, in your early life, what was it like? One of them, I remember, grew up in Oklahoma and told about when he was a boy, he had to be particularly careful with his neighbors on Oklahoma prairies. They were Indians.
Oh, Brad, maybe we should pivot there. I'll tell you why later, except to say that our congregants really do come from a wide variety of different backgrounds. They come from stories that were sometimes hard scrabble and sometimes difficult. And they came to this place to celebrate the legacy of their lifetimes and the legacy that we share together. In many ways, this is the journey of our lifetime, the journey that we share. And I want to close the panel with a quick reflection on what our founders asked for us and wished for us as we move forward together into the future. When you guys made wishes about the future of this place, you wished that we take care of each other. You wished that we flourish and grow in diversity. You wished that we would spend real time together more often. And you wished that we might take better care of the world in this time of its most dire need. And so, having been so abundantly blessed by these, our founders, why don't we thank them? You can stay seated for a second. And while you are standing, we will sing together the chorus of Pass on the Light, a tribute to our founders, and then you can move out. That's Pass on the